Hello, sisters. I am Sister Barbara Valukas, SSND, your assembly facilitator. Since your assembly will be one of communal discernment, the most important thing to say about communal discernment is that the goal is for a group to come to one mind and heart about what it can say and do together.
Communal discernment is about listening to the Holy Spirit to discover God's will. Sister Janet Ruffing, in her book Beyond the Beginnings, says that we can know that we have touched God's will when we touch our own deepest desires as purified through prayer. So communal discernment is marked by prayer and by sharing of the desires that have come into our prayer. An important way that we can come to know what God is doing in our prayer is through faith sharing. Each day of a chapter of communal discernment begins with faith sharing. Faith sharing helps discerning groups to become spiritually acquainted, to begin to perceive what God is doing in them, not just as individuals, but as a group. In fact, if we cannot come to an awareness of how God is acting in our small group, then it will be difficult for us to become aware of how God is acting in the whole group. Each day's faith sharing will be preceded by a time of contemplative silence in order to become spiritually attuned to each other. There is a story about a Swiss scientist who wanted to see what happened if he put several grandfather clocks in the same room for 24 hours. When he first put them in the room, their pendulums were all swinging to different rhythms. But when he returned after 24 hours, the pendulums were all swinging together. He discovered that there was a dominant clock, and that all of the other clocks adjusted their pendulums to its rhythms. For me, this became a powerful metaphor for communal discernment, if the dominant clock is the Holy Spirit and not any one person. The adjustment to a communal rhythm often happens in the silences and in the prayer. Communal discernment draws on all of our sources of energy. We need to use our heads to absorb a lot of information and to think clearly. We need to pay attention to our hearts. We do this every day by beginning our faith sharing with sharing the feelings that are in our hearts. We need to pay attention to our guts, our instincts. Sometimes valuable insights come to us more strongly through our intuitions than through our heads. Communal discernment is a movement. It's a movement from divergence to convergence. How long that movement takes depends on how much divergence there is to begin with and how many persons are involved in the discernment. This means that it takes time. It is a journey that we make together. And in faith, we know that the journey will lead us to one mind and heart, because that is where God is always drawing us, towards unity. Communal discernment challenges us to listen to each other across our differences, to reach out to each other, as is shown so well by this statue in Northern Ireland. The two figures reaching out to each other across their differences to find some mutual understanding and possibilities. This reaching out to each other is an essential part of communal discernment. I always say that communal discernment is also a spiritually muscular process. It takes a lot of spiritual strength to engage in communal discernment because it demands a lot of us in terms of the quality of our listening and the integrity of our sharing. Like physical muscles, these spiritual muscles improve with practice. If this spiritual discipline is embraced, then you will be providing for each other an environment that is safe, transparent, and supportive. I'd like now to review some of the principles of communal discernment, because communal discernment is rooted in some clear principles that serve as ground rules that guide the discipline of it. One of these principles is that everyone in the discernment has equal access to the information for the discernment. There are no secrets, no special groups who have more information than others. That is where the transparency comes in. One of the most transparent aspects of this process is seen in the process of discernment for leadership. That the nominees are seated at the tables with other chapter members for two reasons. First, they should not be hearing anything that has not already appeared in the letters of invitation or has been spoken to them directly. Second, they are also discerners and cannot be separated from the collective wisdom of the discerning group. The nominees will participate in many parts of the discernment, but generally take the role of observers when the process moves to the expression of preferences. The members of the outgoing leadership team may also choose to take the role of observers when it comes to the expression of preferences. Another principle of communal discernment is the principle of the integrity of the dialogue. At times, we need to have one-on-one conversations with others, especially with nominees for leadership. We make a commitment to speak to them to their faces and not behind their backs. As a group, we make a commitment to have the meeting at the meeting and not behind closed doors after the meeting. This doesn't mean that at the end of the day you can't reflect on what has happened so far. It does mean that you can't get together with your friends and decide what's going to happen the next day. That would be trying to do the work of the Holy Spirit, and it would be an example of having the meeting after the meeting. The spiritual discipline of communal discernment assumes the human skills of consensus building. In this diagram, the vertical red arrow represents assertiveness, or the ability to speak one's truth, and the horizontal blue arrow represents responsiveness, or the ability to listen to the truth of others. The ability to speak one's own truth can range from low to high. The ability to listen to the truth of others can also range from low to high. So we have 5 possibilities. Some people are very assertive. They have a high ability to speak their own truth, but a low ability to listen to the truth of others. This is represented in the upper left-hand corner of the picture with the big mouth and the small ears. Such people are often experienced as dominators in the group. At the opposite end, in the lower right-hand corner, are the people with the big ears and the small mouths. They have a tendency to listen to the truth of others and simply go along with it, without expressing their own needs or different ideas. In the lower left-hand corner, with the small mouth and the small ears, represent the people in every group who will not speak their own truth nor listen to the truth of others. These people are generally experienced as the resistors in any group. Their silence sometimes has a powerful controlling effect on the group. The upper right-hand corner represents the ideal in consensus building and communal discernment. To have a normal mouth and normal ears, in other words, a balanced ability to speak one's own truth and to listen to the truth of others. These persons are experienced as collaborators and consensus builders. In the center of the circle, that represents the people in every group who go halfway with speaking their truth or listening to the truth of others. These are the compromisers. In the next images, I will offer some examples of the difference between compromise and consensus. One example of coming to consensus is illustrated by the story of 2 students in a school library. As one gets up to open the window, the other gets up to close it. When the conflict escalates, the librarian intervenes. She first asks the important question, why? Why each person needs the window open or closed. The first student can't study without fresh air. The second student has a cold and can't be in a draft. Secondly, the librarian recognizes the different but legitimate concerns of each student. She also recognizes what the 2 students have in common. Both want to study. So she closes the near window and goes into an adjacent, unoccupied room where she opens a window. Thus, the need to have fresh air and the need to avoid a draft are both honored. A compromise solution might have left the first window half open, which would not have addressed either concern. In the same manner, consensus is an attempt to find creative solutions that honor the legitimate concerns of group members. This is different from watering everything down to the lowest common denominator, which is a common misunderstanding of consensus. The library window story is a hypothetical one taken from a book. The next story is a real-life story taken from the New York Times. One summer, a painting project at Georgetown University required that everything be removed from the classroom walls, including the crucifixes. The administration subsequently decided not to replace the crucifixes on the wall in recognition of the increasingly multi-denominational nature of the student body. However, a group of students was offended by this. When the conflict got press attention, a dialogue between the administration and the students ensued. The students wanted to recognize the Roman Catholic identity of the university, and the administration wanted to recognize the increasingly multi-denominational nature of the student body. On the surface, the desires of the administration and the students seemed to be irreconcilable. However, remaining in the dialogue produced a solution. The original crucifixes were not replaced, but the administration commissioned artists from various denominations to create depictions of Jesus' crucifixion to place around the university. This creative solution sought to honor both the multi-denominational nature of the university and its Catholic identity. A third example was written up in America magazine and describes an inspiration of John Paul II that saved the 1986 World Day of Prayer for Peace in Assisi. In the early stages of planning for the event, a problem presented itself. Could Christians, Muslims, and Jews literally pray together in the sense of using the same prayer language, when in fact their beliefs and religious language were different? Some tensions appeared as the planning for the day proceeded. John Paul proposed another window in the library by offering a new concept. He proposed that the purpose of the gathering could be understood not so much as to pray together, but rather as to be together in prayer. Each group or delegation would offer prayer in accord with its prayer tradition. Only the adherents of that tradition would be actively involved in the prayer. The rest would be present as witnesses who believe both in God and in the efficacy of prayer. Their presence was to be an act of solidarity with one another as they witnessed the richness and variety of prayer offered to God for peace, that deep desire of the human heart. This clarification dissolved the apprehensions that many expressed about the day. When groups are working toward convergence, there are two tyrannies or dangers that can keep them from achieving a common mind and heart. The first of these tyrannies is called tyranny of the majority. This occurs when either in the small groups or the large group there is no effort to listen to the views of persons who are in the minority, whereas true consensus and true communal discernment challenge us to listen to the views of everyone, especially to their legitimate concerns. The other tyranny is the opposite of the first. It is the tyranny of the minority. This happens when a person in a small group or in the large group sees that the group is moving in a direction, but stubbornly refuses to allow her thoughts or preferences to be influenced in any way by the prayer and dialogue, and prevents the group from being able to come to anything together. People who come into a communal discernment like rocks and go out like rocks may be legally qualified to be delegates, but they have spiritually disqualified themselves from being authentic participants in a communal discernment. The ideal is to keep the fluidity and receptivity of water, as in the passage from the Old Testament, "May my heart be like water in the hands of the Lord." This disposition will help the flowing together toward consensus. There are times when, even with the best of efforts, the group is unable to come to consensus around a decision, and it is realistic to raise questions about what the options are when that happens. In the literature and practice of consensus building, there are what are called closing options. It is helpful to know what the options are, if and when the group cannot come to convergence. There are some options, but some of them are difficult to apply to a chapter, for reasons I will explain. One of the options, for example, is to extend the time of the meeting. While it is sometimes possible to extend the time by adding an evening session, it is generally not possible to extend the days of the chapter itself. The beginning and ending days of chapters are usually decided well in advance and generally cannot be changed. Another option is to withdraw the matter under consideration. In chapters of affairs in which there are proposals, it is possible to withdraw a proposal that is not receiving much support, but it is not possible to withdraw the main question or questions to be discerned at the chapter of affairs. This option is also something that doesn't apply easily to discernment for leadership. Individual nominees always have the canonical right to withdraw from the process, but you can't withdraw the election itself from the chapter agenda. An option developed by the Quakers is called stepping aside. This can occur when a group has moved strongly toward a certain direction, but there are one or two persons who find that they cannot support that direction for some reason. Instead of exercising the tyranny of the minority, they voluntarily step aside in order to allow the group to come to a consensus decision. They tell the group with whom they are in dialogue that they will step aside from blocking the group's ability to come to something together. This does not mean that they absent themselves from casting a ballot when that time has come. Another option is for the large group to empower a smaller group to meet, to discover a solution which they will then propose to the larger group for consideration. This is an option that can be used when a group is setting directions, for example, but it is not applicable to an election discernment because the call to leadership comes from the chapter and not from a small group within the chapter. And finally, if all of these options have been tried, and the group is still not able to come to consensus, and it is necessary to finalize a decision before the meeting ends, then the group must vote. This voting represents a decision by the group to move on, even without a unanimous decision. Ladislas Orsi, a Jesuit canonist who has written much about communal discernment, says that communal discernment does not necessarily produce the best decision, only the best possible decision, given the conditions present. What are those conditions? One of the conditions is the quality of the information that is gathered and shared. Another condition is the quality of the prayer and dialogue among the discerners and their spiritual freedom. Another condition is the quality of the commitment to the congregational charism, mission, and identity, which leads to a commitment to the common good of the whole. Another condition is the time available for the discernment. There is an Irish Jesuit who teaches that all discernment takes place in real time. Another condition is the extent to which the congregation is in denial about its reality, or, the opposite, the congregation's willingness to look at its reality. All discernment takes place in real time. Ladislaus Orsi teaches that we will never know until we get to heaven if we have made the absolute best decision through communal discernment. The goal is to make the best possible decision with the information we have, the time we have, and the other conditions that he has identified. So communal discernment does not guarantee the absolute best decision, but the best possible decision given the conditions present. Spiritual writers tell us that in a communal discernment, everything we do to get ready to discern is as important as the final decision-making itself. This is why there are steering committees and chapter preparation committees to help prepare for the important decisions you will need to make prior to the chapter, as well as at the chapter. Your committee has been doing and continues to do an outstanding job of preparation and communication. Discernment is a movement from the I to the we. This means that it is fine to know our preferences going into the discernment, as long as we are open to be influenced by the prayer and the dialogue in the movement toward what we can say together.
The U movement is an image of the way that change happens in organizations through a series of 3 transformations, and it applies to both the Assembly of Affairs and the Assembly of Elections. Starting at the upper left, The first transformation is the transformation of perceptions. This happens in the assembly preparation and the early stages of assembly prayer and dialogue. It happens when assembly members move beyond their own individual perceptions to seeing the congregation as a whole. The second transformation is the transformation of will. This happens when individuals are able to let go of some of their ideas and positions as they begin to see the implications for the whole congregation. This is a moment of conversion of heart in which the letting go is followed by what is called a letting come of new insights about the directions needed to go forward. The transformation of action occurs in post-assembly implementation. Assemblies set directions, but after the assembly, the directions need to grow into actions at the personal, the local, and the congregational level. These actions then influence new perceptions, and the learning cycle starts all over again. Your congregation practice begins with the discernment of leadership culminating in the assembly of elections. So I will describe how that proceeds in a communal discernment process.
The process will actually begin months before the chapter of elections, when you think and pray about the sisters who are eligible to be elected, and participate in the process of inviting them to enter the discernment process. This will be done by writing a letter of invitation, including a few of your most important reasons for inviting the person, in the context of the leadership role and the issues emerging for discernment at the chapter of affairs. Notice that these are not nominations, but invitations. The persons who receive them are then invitees, not nominees, yet. If you have some general concerns about the person's ability to fulfill the leadership role, then you have the opportunity to offer them on the letter of invitation. Notice that it says concerns relating to you which could help your personal and our communal discernment. Your only motive for writing a concern should be to help the discernment. You don't have to make up a concern if you don't have one. On the other hand, you will not be allowed to share a concern at your table during this discernment if it has not appeared in the letter of invitation, or has not been spoken to the nominee, or been expressed by the person herself in her self-presentation. Nominees will be sitting at the tables with you because they are also electors, and they cannot be excluded from the discernment. In justice and in love, no nominee should hear any concern about herself for the first time during the election discernment. This is what it means to create a safe, transparent, and supportive environment for each other. Every letter of invitation is signed, another mark of transparency. It follows the principle that all of the information for the discernment is available to everyone. There is no secret information. Also, the letters will be sent to someone designated by the steering or chapter planning committee. Copies will be made and sent to the persons invited, but other copies will be made available to the sisters who will be participating in the chapter. Sometimes these letters are made available for a period of time immediately before the chapter, but they remain available during the chapter to be read by the participants as a help to their discernment. The invitees who come to the weekend of discernment some weeks prior to the chapter will have an opportunity to read each other's letters of invitation. The letters will be available at the chapter for your perusal, following the principle that all of the information for the discernment is equally available to everyone. Sisters who receive sufficient invitations are invited to attend a weekend of discernment. As one part of this weekend of discernment, I give some further input on discernment as it applies in a special way to those discerning for leadership. Part of this input has to do with understanding the call to leadership. It is not like the vocation call. It does not come to the person so directly from God. The call to leadership does come from God, but not directly. It is a mediated call. It is mediated through the call of the sisters of the congregation. When you write your letters of invitation, you are exercising your right to call sisters to leadership. This also serves to clarify the question to be discerned by those who receive invitations. They do not have to discern whether God is calling them to leadership. They only need to discern whether they are free to be called or not called by the sisters, if the call should come to them during the chapter of elections. So it is really a discernment about inner freedom. At the weekend of discernment, the members of the outgoing leadership team share their reflections on the blessings and challenges of leadership as they have experienced it, and on the front burner issues they see facing the new leadership team. This input serves as a powerful sounding board against which the invitees can test their inner responses. After the discernment weekend, there will be some time for the invitees to reflect a little more. Then they will return a response form indicating whether or not they will remain in the process and for which positions. This is important because you don't want to get to the chapter of elections and discover that you have several nominees, but none willing to serve as the major superior. The sisters who discern to remain in the process then become nominees. When preparing for or living a chapter of elections, there are two canonical rights that need to be kept in balance: the right of the nominees to withdraw from the process at any time without giving a reason, and the corresponding right of the electing body to add to the nominees if there is any unease about proceeding with the election with the nominees that are in the process. At the chapter, I need to check in with the delegates to see if they are ready to proceed. A question always arises about what a congregation does if there are not enough nominees. These are the common options: to ask previous discerners to reconsider, to invite a new person to consider for the first time, to notify Rome if there are not enough nominees, if the congregation cannot surface its own leaders. But it's important to know that Rome could then appoint someone of its own choosing, not necessarily a member of the congregation. Once you have indicated that you are ready to proceed with the process, one of the first steps is to hear self-presentations of not more than 10 minutes from the nominees. The main purpose of these presentations is for the nominees to share what was at the heart of their own discernment that could help the discernment of the chapter. Because communal discernment and consensus building assume that every voice is heard in the dialogue, the structure of the process is built around two kinds of small groups. In order to maximize participation, you will be working in two kinds of groups at the chapter. The first one is the base community. The base communities are each meant to represent the diversity that is present in the whole congregation, as much as that is possible. It is in the base communities that faith sharing takes place on alternating days, and the first discussion of a question takes place. Each base community has its own facilitator, who will help you to work toward what you can say together to your respective consensus groups. Base communities can have from 6 to 8 members depending upon the size of the whole chapter. In this diagram, I am using only 3 symbols to represent 3 individuals. One of the persons in each base community is represented by a heart symbol, another by a polygon, and a third by a rectangle. It is helpful to remember these symbols when we look at the next diagram. The base communities alternate with the consensus building groups in the movement from divergence to convergence. Consensus groups are composed of persons from several base communities, so there's an opportunity to get a sense of what is moving in the larger group. You will notice that the persons represented by the heart symbol in the base community are now all in one consensus group. The persons represented by the polygon are now all in one consensus group. The persons represented by the rectangle are all in one consensus group. So each consensus group becomes a cross-section of the whole group. Faith sharing takes place in consensus groups on alternating days. The consensus group is also charged with gathering the wisdom from the respective base communities and moving the discernment forward with that wisdom. At the chapter of elections, you will be seated with your base communities as you listen to the self-presentations. Nominees will be part of these groups, as will members of the outgoing leadership team.
At the Assembly of Elections, the base communities work together on any questions they may wish to address to a nominee. The base communities need to agree that the question is appropriate, relates to the leadership role, and will help the discernment. If it is just one person's question, she can be encouraged to ask the nominee personally. The questions are then put in writing and given to me to distribute to the nominees for their reflection and response.
The nominees then have an opportunity to read the questions and prepare their responses. At the chapter of elections, there is an objective phase in which the base communities discuss for all of the nominees for a certain role the reasons why it would be good for the congregation if that person were called to leadership, and, if appropriate, any concerns that are in the public domain. That is, that they have appeared in the letters of invitation, have been expressed to them personally, or have been mentioned in their own self-presentations. The objective phase is followed by a subjective phase in which the base community members express preferences and work toward a smaller number of possibilities. The base communities then alternate with the consensus building groups in the movement from divergence to convergence. Remember that consensus groups are composed of persons from several base communities, so there is an opportunity to get a sense of what is moving in the larger group. Through the alternation of the dialogue in the base and consensus groups and the posting of names that have been agreed upon at the chapter of elections, you will begin to get a sense of the movement that is happening in the larger group. When you have come to consensus on the person or persons you want to call forth in a particular role, then you will move toward balloting to confirm the consensus that has been arrived at through prayer and dialogue. In this process, the ballot is not used as a means of discernment. It is used as a confirmation of a discernment that has been completed through prayer and dialogue. If consensus is not reached, and there is not sufficient time to work toward it further, then it is sometimes necessary to simply move to a ballot. At the chapter of elections, after ballots have been distributed, counted, and tallied, and if there has been an election, the presider asks the canonical question, "Do you accept the election?" This question must be publicly asked and answered for an election to be considered validly concluded. I want to move on now to show how these principles of communal discernment and consensus building are lived out in the preparation for and at the chapter of affairs, which has the canonical responsibility of direction setting. The first transformation of perceptions is usually accomplished by engaging the membership in a series of feedback loops or conversations about the issues that they see are most critical to the congregation. The summaries of these conversations are analyzed and returned to the members to prioritize. When there is sufficient clarity about the issues that are most important for consideration by the chapter, the issue or issues are converted into questions to be discerned. Every discernment, personal or communal, begins with a question to be discerned. For chapters of affairs, the main agenda is a question or questions to be discerned, in contrast to proposals to be debated. Discernment questions are questions that are asked of God as well as of each other. They are questions that are based in the belief that God has desires for the group, and that the purpose of discernment is to come to a common awareness of those desires. Since the responsibility of the chapter of affairs is direction setting, the discernment question usually addresses in some way where the congregation most needs to go or grow or learn. Because communal discernment and consensus building assume that every voice is heard in the dialogue, the structure of the process is built around two kinds of small groups. In order to maximize participation, you will be working in two kinds of groups at the chapter. The first one is the base community. The base communities are each meant to represent the diversity that is present in the whole congregation, as much as that is possible. It is in the base communities that faith sharing takes place on alternating days, and the first discussion of a question takes place. Each base community has its own facilitator, who will help you to work toward what you can say together to your respective consensus groups. Base communities can have from 6 to 8 members depending upon the size of the whole chapter. In this diagram, I am using only 3 symbols to represent 3 individuals. One of the persons in each base community is represented by a heart symbol, another by a polygon, and a third by a rectangle. It is helpful to remember these symbols when we look at the next diagram. The base communities alternate with the consensus building groups in the movement from divergence to convergence. Consensus groups are composed of persons from several base communities, so there's an opportunity to get a sense of what is moving in the larger group. You will notice that the persons represented by the heart symbol in the base community are now all in one consensus group. The persons represented by the polygon are now all in one consensus group. The persons represented by the rectangle are all in one consensus group. So each consensus group becomes a cross-section of the whole group. Faith sharing takes place in consensus groups on alternating days. The consensus group is also charged with gathering the wisdom from the respective base communities and moving the discernment forward with that wisdom. The consensus groups gather up the wisdom from their respective base communities and then do their original work to discover what they can say together. This is where the letting go and the letting come often happen, in the movement from the I to the we. Consensus groups record their agreements on large post-it notes called idea catchers. The ideas that are the same or similar are posted one under the other. The ideas that are different are posted horizontally next to each other. In this picture, the green idea catchers were posted by chapter delegates, while the yellow idea catchers were posted by non-delegate chapter participants who were seated at their own tables. When the chapter members feel that they have reached sufficient consensus around the core directional ideas, their work is turned over to a team of writers who bring back drafts until the chapter is satisfied with the directions and is ready to affirm them with a vote. I usually test the group's readiness to vote with a show of hands or colored cards. Most chapters today do not choose to vote on the chapter directions with written ballots. They vote with the cards or with the show of hands.
The dialogue that begins in your small groups before the assemblies will help you to come to a common mind and heart at the assemblies, both with respect to your leadership and with respect to your congregational directions. I have enjoyed working with your steering committee and look forward to journeying with you also in the coming months in preparation for your assemblies. Thank you.